Imagine this, you're minding your own business, just trying to go about your day, when out of nowhere, a police officer starts making assumptions about you based purely on the color of your skin. Now, picture that you're not just anyone, you're a Black Navy SEAL, someone who served their country with honor, fought for freedom, and yet here you are, being harassed in public for no reason at all. That's exactly what happened to one man who found himself in a confrontation with a racist cop. This isn't just a story of injustice, it's a story of standing up, of confronting hate with dignity and strength. The officer, whose arrogance made him believe he could treat anyone however he wanted, quickly learned that not everyone is going to back down. The tension builds as this Navy SEAL takes a stand, proving that you can never judge someone based on their appearance, and that respect is earned, not demanded. But what happened next? How did this confrontation unfold, and what lesson did the officer learn that day? Stay tuned as we dive into this shocking encounter that will have you questioning the system and witnessing an incredible act of courage and strength. The scene begins on a typical afternoon, a busy street in the heart of a small town. People were going about their business, some shopping, others chatting, or simply enjoying the fresh air. Among them was James, a Black Navy SEAL who had recently returned home after a tough deployment overseas. Dressed casually in a hoodie and jeans, he didn't look like the kind of person you'd expect to cause trouble. But to one police officer, that was all it took to start a confrontation. The officer, a middle-aged man with a stern expression, had been patrolling the area. His eyes locked onto James, and instantly he made assumptions. Maybe it was the hoodie, or perhaps it was just the old biases that had been ingrained in him for years. Without any reason or evidence, the officer decided to approach James, his tone condescending from the very start. "Hey, you there," the officer called out, stepping forward. "What are you doing around here? You look suspicious." James, taken aback, stood still for a moment, trying to process the situation. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He had every right to be there. But the officer wasn't having it. He demanded James show ID, accused him of loitering, and made it clear that he wasn't welcome. James tried to stay calm, knowing that this wasn't a fight he wanted to start. But deep down, he knew this wasn't just about a misunderstanding. This was about something much bigger. As the officer's demands grew more forceful, the tension between him and James escalated. James, trying to keep his composure, knew all too well the danger of losing his cool in situations like this. As a Navy SEAL, he had faced life-and-death moments on the battlefield, but this was different. This wasn't about combat skills, it was about something far more personal. It was about the quiet, invisible war that Black men and women often face when they're judged by the color of their skin rather than the content of their character. "You're not going anywhere until I see your ID," the officer barked, his tone dismissive and filled with suspicion. James hesitated for a moment. He didn't have to prove anything to this man, but the thought of what could happen if he refused or challenged the officer too strongly weighed heavily on his mind. The officer's hand hovered near his belt, ready to grab his radio or worse, his weapon. The situation was starting to feel more and more dangerous, like a powder keg waiting to explode. Nearby, a few onlookers began to notice the confrontation. A couple of people quietly took out their phones, the hum of camera lenses snapping into focus, adding another layer of tension to the scene. They could sense that something wasn't right. Was James just another target of police overreach? Or was this just another routine check that had gone sideways? Regardless, no one was stepping in. They were too afraid, too unsure of how things might play out. James' mind raced. He didn't want this to turn into an all-out confrontation, but he also knew that if he let this go without speaking up, he was reinforcing the idea that it was acceptable for people like him to be treated this way. He felt the weight of his decision settling on his shoulders. What would happen if he said no? Would it escalate even further? Could he walk away without risking his safety or dignity? As the officer grew more impatient, his voice rose. "I'm not asking you, I'm telling you. Show me your ID, now." The air between them felt thick, charged with an uncomfortable energy. It was like both men were standing on the edge of something much bigger than either of them realized. James could feel the eyes of those around him, the silent spectators, the ones who would go home and tell the story, but only if things didn't go wrong. For a split second, James locked eyes with the officer. In that brief moment, everything seemed to slow down. He saw a man, but also a system, a machine of authority that had been built on fear, assumptions, and biases. The question now was, how far would that machine go to protect its own? Would James play along and let the system continue, or would he break it wide open in front of everyone watching? The officer's grip tightened around his belt, his fingers brushing the handle of his baton as if ready to escalate the situation. James could feel the officer's impatience growing with every passing second. The crowd, though still a silent witness, had begun murmuring. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension, and James could sense the onlookers' growing unease. They were waiting, just like him, to see how this would unfold. He looked around, his instincts on full alert. His military training kicked in, and for a moment, he thought about how he could defuse the situation without anyone getting hurt. He knew how to handle himself in high-pressure moments, but this was different. He wasn't facing an enemy combatant. He was facing someone who had the power to ruin his life with just one wrong move. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, the sweat on his palms, but his resolve was firm. The officer's voice grew louder. "You think you're above the law? You think you can just walk around here, looking suspicious, and not show me your ID?" His words were laced with hostility, his authority challenged by the very presence of James. The officer wasn't just angry, he was losing control, and the anger was seeping into every word, every movement. The situation was spiraling. James' mind raced. He could feel the pull of two choices, one that would keep him safe, and one that could put him at risk. If he complied, he could go home, chalk it up to a terrible encounter, and try to forget it. But if he didn't, if he challenged the officer, questioned his right to treat him this way, the consequences could be anything from a simple ticket to something far more dangerous. The officer was already showing signs of aggression. Would he retaliate if James stood his ground? What would the crowd do? His fingers twitched, wanting to reach into his pocket for his ID to end this whole interaction. But then he thought of all the times his brothers and sisters in arms had stood up against injustice, not just on the battlefield, but in everyday life, where silence was complicity. James knew what was at stake. He wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for every black man who had ever been unfairly judged by their skin color. This was bigger than a simple confrontation. It was a stand. The officer, growing more agitated, took a step closer, his chest puffing out as if to intimidate James. "I'm giving you one last chance. Show me your ID, or you'll regret it," he threatened. The words hung in the air like a ticking time bomb. Everyone around them was holding their breath, waiting for the inevitable spark. Would this go down in a way that everyone would remember? Would James fight back, or would the officer's aggression turn the situation into something far more serious? In that brief, heart-stopping moment, James knew that whatever happened next would define not just his day, but potentially his life. The clock was ticking, and the choice was his. The tension was unbearable, and the resolution, for better or worse, was just moments away. Just as James opened his mouth to speak, ready to respond to the officer's ultimatum, something unexpected happened. From behind the officer, a new voice cut through the tension, sharp and commanding. "Hey, what's going on here?" The voice was calm, but the authority behind it was undeniable. James turned his head, his pulse spiking. Another officer, younger and with a more professional air, had appeared out of nowhere, stepping into the scene with an immediate sense of control. The older officer, still bristling with frustration, turned quickly, clearly annoyed at the interruption. "What's it to you?" he snapped, clearly unwilling to let go of the power struggle he'd started. But the new officer didn't flinch. "I'm Officer Martinez," the new voice said, his gaze shifting from the older officer to James. "What's the problem here?" The older officer hesitated, and for a split second, the anger in his eyes faltered. It was almost as if he was caught off guard, realizing that someone with a level head had just walked into a situation that was spiraling out of control. James kept his eyes fixed on the new officer, trying to gauge his intentions. Was this officer here to back him up, or was he going to side with the other cop? The tension was unbearable as the crowd watched the power dynamics shift before their eyes. The older officer gritted his teeth, clearly unwilling to back down without a fight. "This guy's being difficult. I'm trying to do my job," he said, throwing James a glare full of accusation. "I told him to show ID, and he refused." Officer Martinez's eyes narrowed as he assessed the situation. Did he break any laws? Did he commit a crime? His words were measured, calm, yet cutting. "Because from what I can see, this looks more like harassment than a lawful stop." James felt a knot in his stomach. The conflict had just gone from bad to worse. Now, there were two officers, each with their own version of events, and the tension between them was palpable. The crowd watched closely, the weight of the moment hanging over everyone like a storm waiting to break. The older officer shifted on his feet, clearly not expecting to be questioned in front of an audience. He glanced at James once more, his face twisting in frustration. "I don't need you telling me how to do my job," he muttered, but there was a hint of doubt in his voice now. Martinez wasn't having it. "Actually, I do. And right now, I'm telling you to stand down." The stakes had just been raised, and James could feel the heat of the moment. The older officer's grip on his baton tightened, his body language aggressive as he glared at Martinez, who remained calm and composed. James' heart was pounding in his chest. This was it, the tipping point. Whatever happened next would either end this nightmare, or it could push everything over the edge. Martinez turned slowly to James, his expression softening for the first time. "You all right?" he asked, his voice low but sincere. James nodded, but his mind raced. Was Martinez here to help, or was this just another twist in a dangerous game of power? And how far would this older officer go to protect his own pride? For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The older officer stood motionless, his eyes still locked on Officer Martinez, who remained calm and unshaken. The crowd, sensing the shift, held their breath, unsure of how this would end. James, his chest tight, could hardly believe what he was witnessing. The situation was on the brink of collapse, but instead of violence, there was an unexpected stillness, a kind of tense calm that seemed to hold everything in balance. Finally, the older officer took a step back, his face reddening with embarrassment and fury. "This isn't over," he muttered, though his words carried far less weight now. He shot one last glare at James before turning and storming off, his boots slapping against the pavement with a finality that felt like a release. The crowd exhaled in unison, a quiet murmur running through the people who had been watching from the sidelines. Martinez didn't move at first, letting the older officer retreat into the distance. When he turned back to James, his expression softened, and there was a hint of understanding in his eyes. "I'm sorry about that," he said, his voice quieter now. "I know that shouldn't have happened." James, still processing what had just unfolded, nodded. The tension in his body started to fade, but the questions still lingered. "Why didn't you step in sooner?" James asked, the words slipping out before he could think better of it. "Why let him go that far?" Martinez sighed, his gaze flicking to the ground as if searching for the right words. "You're not the first person he's done this to," he said, his voice low. "We've been getting complaints about him for a while now. But sometimes you can't just show up and force change. It's got to come from the inside. And right now, I'm doing everything I can to get him off the streets." James' heart raced again, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from disbelief. "You're telling me you've known he's been doing this to people?" Martinez nodded grimly. "It's been a pattern, but the system is slow to act. It's always been like that. But today, he crossed the line." There was a pause, and Martinez's eyes met James with an intensity that made the weight of his words hit even harder. "And I won't stand for it anymore." Just as James was about to respond, a sudden noise interrupted them. A car screeched to a halt at the curve, and out stepped a woman James didn't recognize. She looked frazzled, but there was an urgency in her step. As she hurried over, her eyes locked on the two officers. "Officer Martinez," she called out, breathless. "You need to come with me. It's about the investigation." Martins looked confused for a split second, then turned to James. "I'll explain everything soon, all right? But right now, I need to handle something. Wait here, and I'll come back."